Only been on. There's only. Okay. Morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class. Before we get started, we'll be continuing our study on out of order fossils. So we'll be continuing with that. But before we get started, prayer requests. Let's keep in mind those who've been mentioned. So there are some families that are traveling right now. The Carr family, they're in Pittsburgh, and the Lindsays are in Wisconsin. The Dodger bag. Anyone else that we know of that's traveling right now? Okay. And then continue to remember those that are recovering from surgeries. Sister Debbie and her bag, Sister Letha, Craig Goley. Those who have chronic health problems, like Sister Joanne and Sister Bonnie, Sister Sherry. Last time the Reed family was mentioned as having COVID. That was Tina's friends. And then the Tribble family, which are friends of Sister Sharon, and they had a loss in their family. I also mentioned the Compton family. So Ashley Compton, they worship over at West Mason, and she has a condition that's called ADEM. But what it is, it's swelling on the brain and spinal column, and so she's been struggling with that, and her body, is having to relearn how to do certain things. And then also Sue Robinson, so she's Tracy Taylor's mother. So those of you who know the Taylor family, it's Tracy Taylor's mother, but she's been diagnosed with liver, pancreatic, and adrenal gland cancer. And so let's keep them in our prayers as well. Then also remember Sister Sharon's mom with her diabetes, my uncle. Anyone else to add to our prayer list? Okay. All right. I'll ask Brother Larry, if you would please, to lead us in prayer this morning.
Great glory of the Father, come before you, Father, thanking, blessing, lifting up, and come thank you, Father. Father, sacrifice. Yes. Learn lessons. Patience. Help us stimulate their mind.
Yeah. Right, thank you. Okay, so today we have new handouts. If you didn't get one, I think Brother Gene has them, so make sure that you grab one of those. We're continuing our study on fossils that are out of order. And so we'll keep going along this train of thought. Hopefully we'll finish up this topic and then move on to some other topics. We'll still be studying fossils, but we'll move on to some other fossil topics. But so this is part 2 of the out of order series that we've been going through. Just a couple of terms to keep in mind, just a little bit of a review for us again. Geologic time, we've been talking about that. This is Earth's calendar as far as secular reasoning is concerned. It's divided up into eons, eras, and periods, and those are just time periods. Okay, so the periods are what we're probably most familiar with hearing about. So you hear about the Cretaceous and the Jurassic and Triassic and that type of stuff. Those are time periods. Those are the age of the dinosaurs. That's in the Mesozoic era, so a kind of a bigger category. But also very significant for us and what we're studying is what's called the Cambrian and the precambrian. Okay, so the Cambrian time period goes back to about 550 million years ago in the secular ages, and then the precambrian would be anything earlier than that, even going all the way back to the 3.5 billion years old. And the Earth is supposed to be about 4.5 billion years old in this geologic time schedule. We've been talking about fossil succession, so that's the order, the generalized order that you see of fossils that show up around the world, and we talked about why that is significant also last time as we were watching the video. But the fossil succession, and here's the general order that you see. So down at the bottom in the lower rock, you find marine life, mostly shells, so shelled creatures. And then a little bit higher up, you find fish and the fossil record, and then you get to amphibians, and then you get to reptiles higher up, and then mammals, birds, and then mankind higher up in the fossil record. Okay, so there are 2 explanations for this, and as I said, I'll keep making the point that there's only a certain amount of facts that are available. The creationists and the evolutionists have the same facts. What is different is the story that comes along with those facts. Again, we're talking about historical science here. You hear all the time that evolution is science, whereas creation is just is make-believe. But we're talking about historical science. Creationists and evolutionists have the same facts. It's just and you take those facts and then you create a story. It's just like forensics. So you have a story and you come up with the best story that you can, that you think best fits those facts that you find. And so evolution has a story that's based upon the wisdom of man, and then us, as far as creationists, we believe that the story that we find from the Bible is the wisdom of God, and so that's what we hold to as far as explaining the facts that we find. Okay, so the facts are that you find this general order in the fossil record. Okay, so here is the explanation for it in evolutionary terms. First off, it's going to be a record of evolving life. Okay, so you start off with these what are called simpler creatures at the bottom, single-celled organisms, bacteria, worms, things like that down in the precambrian rock, and then you get to shells and then fish and so on. So there's a progression in what's called the progression of evolving life. There's also, the single-cell organisms at the base, and then, as I said, you go up to more complex organisms later on. What you would expect though, so that's explanation, expectations are also very important. So if that is true, then what you would expect to find is you would expect to find billions of intermediate and transitionary fossils. Okay, so if life is evolving from a single cell and it's evolving into everything else that's ever been, that's ever lived on this earth, so plants, animals, everything, then you should see billions of intermediate fossils. So one creature turning into another type of creature. That's what you would expect to find in the fossil record if this is true. And then exceptions would be impossible as far as the record, as far as the order of the fossils that we find in the fossil record. It's impossible to have exceptions because how can you have something show up in the fossil record if it hasn't evolved yet? So there's no room for any type of exceptions in this evolutionary viewpoint and explanation of what we find in the fossil record. However, as creationists, we have a different view. Instead of a record of evolving life, we view the fossil record as a record of the death of organisms being preserved. And so we watched the video the last class period, and that was pointed out. But it's a record of death. It's not a record of evolving life, which is why all of a sudden, when you get to Cameron Rock, you see all these fully formed organisms show up, and with nothing before that, no intermediates, nothing evolving into it in the fossil record. We'd expect that there would be few fossils that are found below the flood layers, whereas the Cameron Rock would be the first layer laid down by the flood. Below that, the Precambrian was called Precambrian. You would expect to find few fossils because there wouldn't have been a lot of fossil-making conditions going on. And then we'd also expect in the fossil record to find larger, smarter, and more mobile creatures at the top. And then we would also expect there to be many exceptions to this rule. Many exceptions. Okay, so whereas in evolution, exceptions should be impossible if the story is true, that everything evolved. You can't have something before it evolved. Where in creation, we would expect, as creationists, we would expect there to be a general order, but there will be many exceptions that go along with that. Okay, so again, this is a key point of that. There should be no exceptions at all if in the fossil order, if the evolutionary story is true. After all, how is it that I could be down here but show up in the ancestry before my great-great-great-grandparents are born? Okay, so that would be the exact thing that would be happening if there are exceptions in the fossil record, if you have things showing up before whatever they're supposed to have evolved from. And the evolutionists know this. And so this guy we talked about before, John Haldane, he said, I will give up my belief in evolution if someone finds a fossil rabbit in the Precambrian. Okay, so that's supposed to be kind of an absurdity, kind of a tongue-in-cheek expression, because in the evolutionist mind, in their time periods, the Precambrian rock would date to at least 550 million years ago, and rabbits are supposed to have evolved about 50 million years ago. And so it's an absurdity to find something hundreds of millions of years before it was supposed to have evolved in the fossil record. So he says, you know, all you got to do is find a rabbit in the Precambrian, and I'll give up my belief in evolution. Okay, so that is what they would say. And then Richard Dawkins, he's kind of a famous atheist, and he was making a comment about this statement, in which has kind of been kind of for the evolutionists, kind of a calling point. But he says evolution makes a strong prediction that if a single fossil turned up in the wrong geological stratum, the theory of evolution would be blown out of the water. And then he goes on to say that no such anachronistic fossils have ever been authentically found. So authentically, whose definition of authentic would that be? And so what we've been doing is we've been going through and we've been examining these out of order fossils. So the exact things that they said, if you find them, I'll stop believing in evolution. There have been many of them that have been found. And again, with evolution, there should be no exceptions. You can't have something that shows up in the fossil record before it's evolved. Tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years before it evolved. That is an impossibility, and they recognize that, and so that's why we have these statements here. All right, so quick review. I'm going through this quick. So Confuciusornis is a bird that predates the feathered dinosaurs that it was supposed to have evolved from. We have Rapinammamus. He's a larger mammal that was found in lower Cretaceous rock that was supposed to be before mammals evolved to that size, but he was big enough to feed on dinosaurs. We found grass and dinosaur dung. Grass was not supposed to have evolved yet. And so you go to museums and stuff and they say that the dinosaurs ate ferns and things because grass hadn't evolved yet, but then we find grass and dinosaur dung. We talked about this before, so here's a 75-foot long trail of human footprints in Tanzania, but they will say that these aren't human footprints. Why do they say they're not human footprints? Well, because they're found in volcanic ash that dates back using their dating methods to 3.75 million years old. However, modern humans are supposed to only be about 200,000 years old. And so, so they'll say, well, these can't be human footprints because humans haven't evolved yet. They know in their minds that humans weren't around. So therefore, this can't be human footprints, even though it's not just one footprint. It's a track of human footprints 75 foot long. There's a trail, people walking. Any child would look at those and say, yeah, these are human footprints. But in their minds, they can't even go there because humans hadn't evolved yet. Again, these are all anachronistic fossils that, that according to these men, should cause them to give up their belief in evolution. We also talked about this. This is Tiktaalik. He's supposed to be the guy in the class, the category of creatures that were the first ones to crawl out of the ocean and onto land. So life was supposed to have evolved in the oceans first, and then something had to come out of the water and crawl onto land, and then all the land animals evolved from that. And so Tiktaalik was supposed to be the alleged intermediate between fish and land animals. But then they go and they find fossil footprints of tetrapods, so four-footed land animals, that date back to about 20 million years before Tiktaalik. And so they come up with different excuses, explanations, and so on as far as what these are, even though they're clearly footprints by a tetrapod, and not even just a tetrapod, but large ones, very large ones. I had a comparison up the other time when we first went over this. But this animal had to be about the size of a lion. It was large paw prints about the size of my hand. Okay, so not like some little baby's, squeaky thing crawling out of the water. It's a large tetrapod, possibly carnivorous, which means that there had to have been other things on land for it to feed on, to eat. But it's 20 years before Tiktaalik was supposed to have climbed out of the water. And so what did they say? They try to make excuses, and then down here in the yellow, they say trace evidence is just not enough for me to change my mind about accepted theories on tetrapod evolution. So what it comes down to is if you can't disprove it, you just ignore it and pretend like it's not there. All right, so these are some things that we have been, that we've previously covered, and then we'll continue on with some more evidence of these out of order fossils, these things that they say if you find them, I'll give up my belief in evolution. But we'll see that that's not what happens. But we'll continue with this. Okay, so here's a short video clip that we'll watch.
Most people know that pollen can cause problems for those who suffer from hay fever. But did you know that pollen is also a major problem for the evolutionary interpretation of the fossil record? Since the 1960s, the scientific literature has reported the presence of pollen and spores within a rock layer called the Roraima Formation in South America. This formation is supposedly over 550 million years old. Yet, according to evolutionary theory, flowering plants that produce pollen didn't evolve for another 390 million years. So why do we find pollen in the fossil record so long before the first flowering plants appear? The simplest explanation is that the fossil record doesn't represent the evolution of life on this planet over eons of time, but is better explained as a consequence of the year-long global flood of Noah and its aftermath. This is recorded in the book of Genesis, chapters 6, 7 and 8.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Okay, so the Roraima pollen. All right, so this rock is Precambrian rock. So we've been talking about Cambrian, Precambrian. The Cambrian rock dates back to 550 million years old, and so Precambrian would be anything before that, going back to billions of years old. And in this Precambrian rock, they find fossilized pollen. Okay, so what's the significance of that? So if you have fossilized pollen, that means you had to have plants that are flowering plants that produce that pollen. All right, the problem with that, though, is flowering plants were not supposed to have evolved for nearly 400 million years later after the Precambrian period had occurred. Okay, so we're not just talking about, 10 million year difference, 15 million year difference, not even 100 million years. We're talking about 400 million years of out of orderness to these fossils that are found. All right, so that is a major problem for evolution and wanting to continue to hold on to the belief because, again, as we just mentioned, evolution makes the claim that there should not be any of these out of order fossils, any of these. And this is not just slightly out of order. You could try and say, there's a tetrapod tracks 20 million years before Tiktaalik. All right, that's not that much. This is 400 million years out of order fossils, things that shouldn't have evolved yet, but we find it there. And so naturally, you'll have some explanations or excuses that have been come up with. So the go-to one is this contamination. So there's always an appeal to contamination. Well, the rock sample must have been contaminated. There had to be something that came in because we know in our minds that it's impossible. So it's an impossibility in their minds that anything could have, that there could have been flowering plants in the Precambrian time period, because to them, that's more than 550 million years ago. So it couldn't have been flowering plants there. So it must have been some type of contamination. And they also appeal to reworking of the rock, so metamorphism. So these things are possible. These things are possible. So there could be contaminated samples. There could be rocks that rework themselves due to through the earthquakes and tectonic activity and things like that. And so these are possibilities. These are things that can happen. But again, this contamination thing is kind of the fallback that you go to. And so anytime, or that they go to. And so anytime that something is found like this, these anachronistic, these out of order fossils, those are the things that are stated. Well, it can't be because they know in their minds that it's impossible. And so it must be some type of contamination. And so that's the first thing that's always looked for. And so this guy Stainforth, he's one of the guys who studied this, and he said, the quote for him, he said, the rocks concerned are unquestionably ancient. And so I'll make a point of this. This isn't a creationist. This is not some creationist out there trying to make up stuff to fit the creationist story. This guy, he's an evolutionist. He accepts evolutionary long ages of the earth and all that. And so he says the rocks concerned are unquestionably ancient, being Precambrian, and are so altered that no organic matter should be recognizable in them. Also, they are physically dense with no obvious routes, such as natural permeability, porosity, or crack systems through which solid materials might enter them. Okay, so what he's saying there is he's ruling out contamination. There's no way that any type of contamination could have gotten there, is what he's saying. And then he says, yet standard paleontological techniques recovered well-preserved fossil pollen from the samples. Okay, so he's ruling out contamination. He says it's not contaminated. There's no way it can be contaminated. There's no way for any type of contamination to come into this, and it's ruled out. Again, we'll go to this. There are no exceptions. Again, from the evolutionary story, you can't have something hundreds of millions of years before it evolved and have evolution still be correct. All right, and again, they understand that, but contamination is kind of the fallback. But that was ruled out, and so what do you do with that? And so that's just one example. There's more. There's a lot more as far as these out of order fossils that are not supposed to exist. So here's another example. This is a salt range in Pakistan, Punjab, Pakistan. And in the 1900s, there was a big debate over how old these rocks were. So scientists were kind of studying them. And what they settled on was that the rocks were Cambrian age rock, based upon the layers below and layers above, the formations that were supposed to be above. And so they spent a lot of time arguing about this and studying it. But one guy said, it was like, if you want to determine how old the rock is, then take some samples of it and see what fossils in there. So if this is salt, that's the positive, in water, salt ranges. And so he was saying, if there was whatever life there was, you should be able to find evidence of that in the fossils that you find in the core if you core this rock. And so what did they find? So this is Cambrian rock. Okay, so they found what are called cryptospores in this rock that were supposed to have evolved 68 million years after the Cambrian time period. Also, they found a winged insect in the rock, which was supposed to have evolved 135 million years later. And then also angiosperms. So they found wood, but these are from flowering plants, which was supposed to have evolved 416 million years later. You find all of this in this rock that they determined to be Cambrian rock. Okay, so this isn't just one rabbit, Precambrian rabbit. It's many of them. So here's just kind of a visual. Here are the cryptospores. That's what they look like, fossilized cryptospores. But they are supposed to not to have evolved until the middle of the Ordovician period right here, which you see. Remember Precambrian down here in the yellow, or I'm sorry, in the green. This is where they found this. We have these angiosperm plants. So these are ones that produce flowers. We're not supposed to evolve up here until the Cretaceous, way up there. And then a whole winged insect. Insects were supposed to evolve during the Devonian period, which is right about there. And so we see all of these fossils that are out of order by, 70 million years, 100 million years, 400 million years. All these fossils are out of order by these long periods of time. And so they go through the usual, but again, this isn't a one-off. They talk about these Precambrian rabbits, and these rabbits, they keep coming. We're pulling them out of the hat. There's Precambrian rabbits all over the place. 400 million years, you can't just explain that away. And so you go back to the fallback, which is contamination. Well, there has to be contamination because we know that these rocks are Precambrian, or that they're Cambrian, and we know that this life hadn't evolved yet, so therefore it must be some type of contamination. Okay, so this is a quote. It says, such fossil finds in Cambrian sediment are impressive and certainly unexpected. However, skepticism was prevalent among scientists. It was suspected that the samples of rock were probably contaminated by younger sediment. That is why the Indian workers repeatedly checked their results, and this always with success. So these scientists that were the ones that were on the scene that were doing this in India, they knew that nobody was going to believe them and accept their work and what they found. And so they made very sure, and they repeated. The scientists at the time, this would have been in the 50s, they did the same, and no one could disprove that these were legitimate finds, that they were contaminated. No one could prove that they were. And so what do? You ignore the evidence. When you can't disprove it, you ignore it. And so this is many years later. This is 2017. Someone wrote this, Dr. Hughes. And so this is part of his quote. He says that this must have clearly been a modern contaminant. Most likely source is modern organic dust particles introduced from the ambient environment, despite the efforts made by Sani's group to sterilize the samples. Okay, so again, researchers at the time, they tried to prove that these samples were contaminated. They couldn't do it. Everything was done to protocol. There are legitimate samples that have been found, and so a guy 50, 60 years later, with there's still no explanation, he just dismisses it. Yeah, it just had to be some type of contamination. And then you just sweep it under the rug, throw it under the table, and just don't talk about it anymore. However, this is ridiculous. First off, he's accusing the doctors, so Dr. Sani and Dr. Lahiri were the ones that were doing it at the time. He's saying that they're incapable of distinguishing between a modern contaminant and fossilized particles. So he's insulting them to begin with. He's saying that they don't know the difference between something that would be modern and a fossil that they find in the rock. And then he also accuses them of being so sloppy in their work that they allow pieces of wood. So there's fossilized wood. So he says they allow fossilized wood to get into their sample from the ambient environment. So that's like just having it outside at the park, and then there's a woody breeze coming through and it's blowing fossilized wood into your study area. It's ridiculous. And then what's even more ridiculous is the fact that there is a whole insect, a fossilized insect, and he tries to just write that off as saying, it must have been some type of modern contamination. You can't have a modern contaminant from the ambient environment that's a fossil. How do you have a fossilized insect just blow into your lab that's indoors, and call that and use that as your excuse instead of believing what's actually in front of you? But the problem is that the worldview won't allow them to believe this. Okay, and so they know it, and I'm not talking about just your general person that believes in evolution. The general, science teacher, professor at a college, whatever, they just believe what they've been taught. They've never known. You won't find this stuff in a textbook. You won't learn about it in school. So they believe what they're taught. I'm talking about the scientists that are out in the field that are writing the textbooks. They know that these fossils exist that disprove, but they continue to deceive people and mislead people, and because they themselves choose to believe. And so just saying that a whole insect, a whole bug is some type of modern contaminant, it's ludicrous and it's preposterous, but they have to do that because they choose to not believe. Their worldview won't allow them to believe. Okay, so here's another guy. His name is Richard Lewontin. He was I think he's passed now, and he was an atheist. He believes now, but that doesn't do him much good. But you can see that he's a brilliant guy. You look behind him, we see all these complicated equations and things that are on the chalkboard that he's writing out. Brilliant man as far as human wisdom goes. But this is his quote. He says, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense," so saying that a modern bug flew into a rock core, that's ludicrous. That's against common sense. But he said our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. He says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. So he admits there's a lot of stuff that we say that's absurd. It doesn't make any sense, but we hold on to that anyway. He says why? He says because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Okay, so materialism is the belief that that there is nothing except for the material world. It rules out any type of supernatural, any type of God, angels, demons, any type of something that you cannot see. It doesn't exist. And so there's a prior commitment to materialism. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. So there's this prior commitment that doesn't allow them to accept anything other than what they already believe. And that's what we see when we see these excuses that are made up as far as people ignoring evidence and saying things aren't what they are and just trying to say that it's contaminated. It's because this is the mindset of a lot of these guys that are out in the field. They have this commitment to materialism. And then he goes on to say, moreover, that materialism is absolute. So it's not changing, it's not going anywhere. It's absolute. Why is it absolute? Because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. We can't allow there to be a God. We don't believe in God. Okay, so, and I'm not painting everyone with a broad brush. There's a lot of people, and there have been books that have been written by paleontologists and things like that who, set out to disprove the Bible and ended up becoming believers themselves. So it all depends on the person, but my issue is with the people in the field who are aware of these things that disprove evolution, but continue to peddle that to the common people who are not aware of this and don't know and never have the opportunity to learn. They're just being deceived. And so again, this guy, Richard Lewontin, I didn't say who, he's a evolutionary biologist, a mathematician, and geneticist, social commenter. I think he's passed. But again, another brilliant guy, as far as worldly standards. And so we're always told that believing the Bible is just blind faith. Believing the Bible is just blind faith, whereas believing in evolution is science. But what we'll see, and we are seeing, and we'll continue to see, is that evolution, instead of science, it's more of a worldview than science. It's a worldview that you interpret everything through. Again, the scientific facts are the same. The question is which explanation best explains what you see. And then when there are things that cannot be explained by evolution, they accept it by faith, by blind faith. Okay, so there's honestly, to me, I'd have to have more faith to believe that there isn't a God and to believe in evolution, the Big Bang and all that, than I would have to believe that there is God. But again, they accuse us of just having blind faith when, as we will see, and we'll continue to see, that it's more so the other way around. So if we go to 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 20, this is what the Bible says. It says, "Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age?" And so we have these guys like Richard Lewontin, brilliant guys, brilliant philosophers, very intelligent people. But God says, "Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world?" And we see that over and over and over and over. That human wisdom can't contradict God's wisdom. All right, so there's no story that isn't true that will ever be proven to be true. People may accept it as true, but you can't prove it as true because it's not, and we know that truth comes from the Word. Okay, so since we have all of these fossils that are out of order, these anachronistic fossils that they said couldn't exist, or else it would blow evolution out of the water, and then they would stop believing in evolution, but they continue to believe. Remember that the evolution itself is never questioned. It's got to be something wrong with the fossils. It's got to be something wrong with the researchers. It has to be contaminated. It has to be something that's not right. But evolution is never questioned. Okay, so this slide is basically what ends up happening. Is basically, I want you to solve a mystery. So go and prove that this was some type of contamination. Go and prove that this didn't happen, or whatever it is. And if you can't solve the mystery, then I want you to rewrite history. All right, and that's exactly what we see all the time with evolution. Anytime you find these anachronistic fossils, these fossils that are out of order, places where they shouldn't be because supposedly they haven't evolved yet, and it's impossible to be older than your great grandparents. But we find this all the time in the fossil record. So we have to just kind of push back time. We got to rewrite history. And so that is frequently what is done is we just got to push back history a little bit. All right, so here's some examples of time that's been pushed back. So vascular plants, these are land plants. And I don't, this one's not on the paper, but they've been pushed back 25 million years based upon fossils that they find. They keep finding fossils, and so we gotta keep pushing it back, push it back. So 25 million years. Winged insects, 80 million years. 80 million years. Okay, we throw these big numbers out, millions of years, and nobody ever really thinks about how long that is. But a million years, that is a long time. It's almost too long of a time if you really think about it to even comprehend how long a million years is. But yeah, we'll push these winged insects back 80 million years because we keep finding fossils, and so it's messing up our order. But we got to push it back because of where we found it. Sharks, yeah, we got to push those back 25 million years. They evolved earlier because we found them in earlier rock. We're not going to question evolution. We're not going to question the story. We'll rewrite history. We'll push those back a little bit. Vertebrates, so animals, creatures that have backbones. So they were not supposed to have evolved to the Ordovician, but they find evidence of them in Cambrian rock now. So we got to push those all the way back to the Cambrian time period. Remember, the Cambrian is where we find all these major phylum, these major categories of animals just show up out of nowhere in the fossil record. Nothing evolving to them, no intermediates between them. You see bacteria in the precambrian, other than like fossilized pollen and things that we've seen, these precambrian rabbits, so to speak. But generally, you find just single cellular, and then all of a sudden you get to the Cambrian, and then you see this everything, all of these fully formed animals, nothing that's evolved to them, just blank. And so they push those vertebrates all the way back to the Cambrian time period where life was supposed to just barely be evolving. Arthropods. So these are animals that have jointed legs and usually an exoskeleton. They had to push those back 40 million years because of new fossil finds. Grass, remember, those weren't supposed to have evolved until after 10 million years after all the dinosaurs had died out. Then we find it in fossilized dinosaur dung, which is called coprolites. So we find it in there, so, oh, well, maybe the dinosaurs did eat grass. There must have been grass around, so therefore you have to push it back. And so now grass has been pushed back 75 million years from when they said that grass at first evolved. And then cells, so eukaryotic cells. So these are the cells, if you remember them from biology class, that have all the organelles in them. So there's a nucleus, there's Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, and all these different things that are inside these cells. They push these back a billion years. A billion years. All right, to the Archean and the Precambrian. All right, so a billion years they push the origin of these cells back to try to maintain the story, that life has evolved from a single cellular organism all by itself. It's that commitment to materialism that Lewontin was talking about. It's that commitment to materialism. And so in order to try to maintain the story, instead of giving up evolution like some of them say that they would, they just try to finagle and rearrange and move things back. And so, again, these out of order fossils, as I say, it does blow evolution out of the water. However, they choose not to accept those things and to try and just rewrite history instead of looking at what the evidence says and where it leads. And so it's one thing to look at what others say and and say, you know, y'all are all wrong about this, which is what we've done. We've proven that what they were saying about this is wrong. But it's another thing to come up with a better explanation. So again, you have the certain amount of evidence that everyone has, and then you have to have a story that goes along that best describes that. And so it's one thing to say y'all are wrong, which they are, and we've proven that, but it's another thing to come up with a better explanation. And so next time on Wednesday, that's what we'll start talking about. We'll start talking about a better explanation for the fossil record and the things that we see in the fossil record, and a better explanation using the information that we have from the Bible, information that we got from God's Word, as far as that goes. So that's where we'll go on Wednesday. Anybody have any questions or comments, anything that you didn't catch as I was going through that? Went through a lot of information pretty quick today. I want to get done with this section. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. They have that commitment though, so it's a hard thing. But you're right. One day, everyone will believe. That's for sure. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. We'll continue on Wednesday.